I want to share a personal experience of mine. If Yedidia talked about his time at Harvard, when October 7th happened, I was a visiting professor at Harvard Law School. I had to go teach 2 days into the war. I was, as everyone here in Israel, my family, my friends, my colleagues at Ben Gurion University, were still grappling with what was happening, a lot of uncertainty, despair, dread, and I had to go teach at Harvard Law School, and I had to go through the Harvard yard, and pass through hundreds of protesters, and I remember stopping on the side of the road and looking on my phone and Googling from the river to the sea, because I didn't know that sentiment. I only knew it from the other side, two rivers to the two sides to the river from the right wing of Israel. I didn't know it from the side of the Palestinians. I remember looking it up. And I remember walking into my classroom. I had about 40 students. I had 3 Jews in the class, most of them Harvard Law School students, a lot of Christian students, and there was a pile of baked good on my table because I knew I needed them. And I had a card on my table from the Christian students saying that they prayed for us in church that Sunday. And I remember standing in front of the classroom and talking about my experience and what I was feeling, and I was showing slides. I was very moved by their gesture. When outside, again, outside there's noise from the protesters, and I need to teach my class. And I remember taking a look at the Jews in my class, and I had a few Jews in my class, and I remember looking at their eyes, and they were scared eyes. A few of the Jews that were in my class are Jews who were not affiliated with Israel or with religion. And I remember fear in their eyes and some kind of a shocked expression on their face. And I remember at that moment that I felt, and I think I've since then learned as vice president for global engagement and talking at Ben Gurion University and talking to Jews and communities around the world, I've learned how that understanding that moment was crucial. So my understanding at that moment was that we in Israel are struggling to understand what happened, from burying our dead to realizing our short-sightedness in understanding the problem, the situation, the threats on Israel, the physical threats, the future of Israel, right? All of this, we were struggling to figure out what to do. But there was a huge segment in the world of Jews around the world that October 7th affected almost overnight, immediately, without them having a choice in it. They're not necessarily Zionists, they're not necessarily have anything to do with Israel, but the impact on them was life-changing because their classmates at Harvard on Sunday, the day after October 7th, signed a petition blaming 35 student organization, blaming Israel for what happened. And they're sitting next to their classmates in class and they're getting looks, and because they're Jews. Again, nothing to do, they don't have to declare their loyalty or their belonging to Israel. So that understanding of them then passing through Harvard Yard, through those protests, understanding what it means to them. And for me as an Israeli, looking at them, I think this is something that we still haven't begun to grapple with. And I think the campus reaction to that and the feeling of the Jews on campuses to the reaction on campuses, that's exactly what stands at the heart of this important report by Rachel and Shlomo. So let me introduce our speakers and the authors of the report. So this is Dr. Shlomo Fischer and Dr. Rachel Fish, both co-directors of the JPPI Jewish World Dialogue Project. Dr. Shlomo Fischer is a senior fellow at JPPI and formerly until retirement School of Education at Hebrew U. Dr. Rachel Fish is a senior fellow at JPPI and the co-directors of Boundless Organization, which engages in Israel education advocacy. I give the floor to you guys.
Okay. Thank you very much, Michal. Okay, so the JPPI Jewish World Dialogue, this is an ongoing flagship project of the Jewish People Policy Institute. It enables us to, as somebody once put it, to take the temperature of diaspora Jewish leadership and engaged Jews in the diaspora. We try to widen as much as possible the people we're in touch with. And we want to get a read on what these people not only think, but what they feel, what they experience, and how do they live and deal with issues. And this year we undertook to talk about what happened on the campuses. The report has just come out. I mean, this is like hot from the oven, right? Anti-Israel protests. I think you see it. You see it. Anti-Israel protests on diaspora campuses. The report has two parts. It has an actual report of the dialogue, which I and Rachel will discuss, and it has a background paper that we composed and which was eventually published in the annual assessment last year and has undergone updating and revision in the light of recent events. And there we talk about some of the ideologies and some of the movements that have been leading these demonstrations of what has happened, and we try to analyze what has happened in the background on ideological background of campuses that Yedidya alluded to and that General Almoga alluded to, and so there are two parts to this report. I want to talk about the participants. As was said, there were 106 participants. These are people who are more engaged than the average. 58% of them are under 35. We made a concerted effort when we first started doing the dialogue 11 years ago. We got your typical UJA people, that is, people who are much older, had lots of money, and they were very active in Federation and UJA. This time, this report, we made an effort to come into contact with younger people. About 50% of the people that we made contact with and that we engaged with have a connection to university, either as students or as faculty or as staff. And like I said, 58% are below the age of 35. They are, however, somewhat more engaged than the usual. 65% said that Israel was very central to their Jewishness and to their Jewish identity. That compares with the statistic from Pew, in which 45% of the respondents at this age level said that Israel is essential to the Jewish identity. So we're talking here more about it's now. We use, since Corona, I mean, everything has a good side to it, and the silver lining of Corona was that we started to do Zoom. Once upon a time, we used to fly to America and talk to these people. We don't do that anymore. And we do it, and Zoom has a characteristic which is surprisingly useful, which is it does breakout groups. And it does breakout groups efficiently. You can, like Star Trek used to beam people up and beam people down. So it breaks great breakout groups. So instead of just talking to 100 people in a room, what we did was that we had 13 sessions, and we talked in intimate groups of 3 to 5 people. And we asked people to reflect upon their feelings, their experiences, and everything like. So yes, I mean, the report has what Doron referred to as harassment, intimidation, etc. That wasn't really, for us, the main focus. The main focus was more, what are people feeling? The ADL records all this stuff. The ADL records how many swastikas are drawn on synagogues in a year, and that's very important. So we thought we wanted to concentrate upon the inner experiences of American Jews, and especially of young people, and especially in connection with university campuses. And what we discovered was that there was something, this is a sort of hackneyed phrase, something of a crisis in identity, or at least an issue, a dilemma of identity among these people. And we wanted to understand it as much as in depth as possible. And we wanted to understand, we started off, in other words, what we found, of course, is that Jewish students who are very liberal, who are very progressive, who thought of themselves as unproblematically liberal, were being systematically challenged about their own self-definition. Come back to that in a second. So we wanted to get a little bit more of a purchase on the roots of liberalism among the non-Orthodox population in the diaspora and in the United States. I'll talk about, we had 2 groups outside of the United States, in Switzerland and in Britain. But we wanted to get more of a purchase on that. And we came up with, and this is that that with this idea that it's very rooted. It's not, when I first started looking into this, I'll put it this way. When I first started looking into this, I assumed that the Jews were liberal because Jews were a minority, and liberalism and liberal assumptions make it possible for a minority to enter into mainstream majority cultures because of the individualistic assumptions, social contract, etc. What I think, after I thought about it some more and read some more and did some more research and talked some more, we came up with the idea that, and there we adopted an idea first floated by the German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt about the Jew as pariah, which basically, I'll say it in a sentence, I'm not going to, in a famous article from 1947, which said that because the Jews viewed themselves as a persecuted minority, they believed, and this is very well rooted in the Jewish tradition, they believe, in the broader sense, they believe that they have the moral authority and the moral stance to be critical of society from a social justice point of view. And this is very rooted in Jewish life. Having grown up in America, I can tell you, it's very rooted in Jewish life. In other words, the privileged position of the persecuted minority. Now, this was sustained, this was especially the case after the Holocaust, and this was sustained even in the face of the phenomenal Jewish success, financial and professional and every other way, after World War II. Now, for the first time, this is being seriously challenged. And young people and the people that Michal described in her class and are undergoing something what can be called misrecognition. In other words, that my view of myself is being seriously challenged, is very different, is being contradicted by other people's view of me. I view myself as a persecuted minority who has the moral authority to critique and to promote social justice concerns. And I'm being told that I'm being part of a privileged oppressor class that is the very paradigm of settler colonialism and of genocide. So my own self-definition is being contradicted by the outside world, by the other. That's unprecedented. It's very unusual. That's unprecedented. And that's the nature of the dilemma that Jewish students are undergoing. And that means and so and Rachel will talk about this a little bit more. So first and foremost, what we found was that Jewish students, or the participants in the dialogue, not only students, the participants in the dialogue are groping for ways in the face of this to put together the two identity commitments that they have, or two major identity commitments that they have, to progressivism and to liberalism and to that agenda, together with their commitment to the State of Israel and Zionism. And they are doing this in various fashions. You know, they're highlighting the fact that Zionism is the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. They are highlighting the liberal roots of Zionism. But these are all efforts to put these two things together, which have now, for the first time, are being portrayed as contradictory and antithetical. So that's what they're doing, and we may hear more about this from Rachel. I want to make one more point, which I think is interesting in the current context, and that is that we have a very small sample. We have 106 people. What we did is we talked to them, and we also gave them a very short questionnaire so that we can standardize the answers across the groups that we worked with. And in the questionnaire, there was a very strong correlation, statistically strong, Pearson 0.57, which is significant, two-tailed, etc. And there was so it's a very small sample, so it's hard to make any generalization, but it was a very intriguing correlation. And that correlation is that between viewing Israel as central to my Jewish identity and viewing the pro-Palestinian demonstrations as anti-Semitic. The more Israel was central to one's identity, the more the respondents viewed the demonstrations as being anti-Semitic. Those who did not say, and that was a minority, but they existed in the sample of those for whom Israel was not central, did not view the demonstrations as anti-Semitic. Now, I think that American Jews, from what we've seen, this is an in-depth qualitative study. It's not a survey, doesn't have statistical validity. It's a qualitative study. But it shows you that we were able to see that there's a betwixt and between element. Jews are trying to reformulate their identity between these two poles of progressivism and Zionism and commitment to Israel. And they're trying to reformulate. And I would suggest very cautiously, but I would suggest that there's a good chance that there will be a split among diaspora Jews and among American Jews regarding to what extent Israel is central to one's identity and what are the implications of that. And I'll just give one possible implication, and that is the recent election, Democratic primaries in New York City, in which was by Zoharan Mamdani. Now, he was endorsed, 27% of the Jewish voters voted for Mamdani. I think it's a significant statistic, has to be taken seriously. And he was endorsed by the most senior Jewish office holder in New York City, and that's Brad Lander, who's the comptroller. And I would venture a bet that those people who supported Mamdani and did not see him as anti-Semitic are those people for whom Israel is less central to their Jewishness and their sense of Jewish identity. So I'm putting that on the table as a suggestion. It needs a lot of further research. It needs a lot of further thing, but I think that's one thing that we learn. Okay, b'vakasha, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Shlomo. Thank you, Michal. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'll just highlight and build off of a few elements that Shlomo shared that we saw from the qualitative conversations we had with the respondents. We did ask these folks, and again, many of them were under the age of 35, which was important for us. And it goes a little bit to Doron's comment earlier, which is, we know that anti-Semitism doesn't exist only within the ivory towers. However, we do understand that the world of ideas deeply matters. And what happens in those ivory towers impacts not only the time that students spend in the campus community, but extends well beyond into social justice movements, politics, media consumption, and the way in which our culture is developing. So the under 35 was a very important population for us to focus on. And when we engaged with many of them, you could hear, as you're hearing from Shlomo, a real tension between understanding progressivism and their own political position around being liberal and democratic, and at times also leaning into progressive ideas and values, and this idea of Zionism. For some of these folks, they could see why there may be a perceived contradiction, but it didn't necessarily mean that was a contradiction for them. They could understand how some of these ideas around progressivism and Zionism are congruent, but how they could express that to their peers, particularly non-Jews, but also in some cases Jews, became a challenge. Around the liberal democratic values that many of these individuals discussed, of course, they talk about freedom of expression, social justice, equality, and it is exactly some of these values that have been hijacked or co-opted in order to present a litmus test that then doesn't allow these young Jews to actually be able to engage in those communities and in those spaces. And that was a very real feeling, and it didn't just exist in the abstract. It had immediate impact in terms of their own identity, let alone the relationships with their peers in friendships, and also in terms of even romantic relationships. Again, as Shlomo mentioned, our research is not quantitative, but it builds off of, in some ways, what you saw from the Cohen Center at Brandeis University and what you saw from Eitan Hirsch's research at Tufts University, where young individuals were talking about feelings of social ostracization and the pressures they felt in order to, in some ways, at least not disrupt the herd mentality and to keep their head down. And if they actually raised their head, there were, as Shlomo mentioned, moments of feeling physically unsafe, and also Yadija mentioned this, let alone mentally unsafe. So that's a real reality now. I would argue, and it doesn't bear in our research, but this happens even much younger, way before students ever even walk onto a campus quad. We are seeing this take place, at least in the context of America. So that's a piece of understanding what's happening. Another piece of understanding is that when it comes to actually thinking about the way in which one actually learns about Zionism and the way in which one actually learns about Israel, there is a real opportunity, and we write about this in one of our policy recommendations, to grapple with the serious nuance and complexity, you'll see one of your favorite words, around how you actually talk about Israelis, Palestinians, society, looking at the relations or lack of relations or conflict with Palestinians in Gaza, the West Bank, surrounding Arab countries, Iran, etc. And what we heard pretty consistently from the respondents is there wasn't enough serious Israel education within the confines of their Jewish educational experience, which was diverse. It wasn't uniform across the board for the 35 and under. Some had day school experience, some had summer camp experience, some had Hebrew school or supplemental school experience. So it didn't have a one size. But what's important to note is that the way in which Israel was presented within the context of Jewish education didn't always allow for the complexity and the nuance to exist, and for students to be able to actually grapple with the hard questions within the confines of the Jewish educational environment. And why I'm emphasizing this is because, as someone who has thought about this for quite a long time and studied about this for quite a long time, I would make the argument that that work of serious Israel education must happen deeper and in a more sophisticated way at a younger age, and allow for really critical thinking and the asking of hard questions in those spaces, not just when they go onto a college campus. The other piece of this is that the word Zionism itself has become a dirty word. And there are some who suggest maybe just get rid of the word Zionism as if it's a marketing and branding idea. And then there are others who would argue that Zionism itself is a concept and a important component of Jewishness. And therefore, how do you actually reclaim Zionism so that it can be resonant and actually relevant in the 21st century, particularly for Jews living in diaspora communities? This is a much larger conversation. Shlomo is 100% right to note that those individuals who feel a connection to Israel, who feel a connection to Zionism, when they encountered moments of anti-Semitism, targeting, discrimination, and or particular types of language, like globalize the Intifada, like Michal, from the river to the sea, they were able to point as that is anti-Semitic versus those who didn't have that connection to Israel and Zionism. So it does leave a larger question about how the Jewish community actually allows for opening up to engage in a much more deep conversation that can be more broad ranging on these subjects without saying that there are lines that can't be crossed. And at the same time, what does it mean for many of these organizations to delineate some red lines when they have a clear mission that is not at all one to promote an anti-Zionist position? So this is part of the larger Jewish intra conversation before you go out into the larger university conversation. So I'll leave it at that.